Hey YouTube, what's up? My name's Kurt, this is Oaken Ammo, and today we are looking at one of the most iconic and enduring rifles in all of history, the Mosin Nagant, specifically the M90-130, also known as the garbage rod. While I don't think it's one of the best rifles ever made, I think its historical importance makes it very interesting, and honestly, I kind of just love shooting it. Go ahead and leave me a comment on how you think it sucks and I should shoot a Mauser instead. Meanwhile, like and subscribe as well, and let's get into it. Today, we are rocking an original Russian field cloak, specifically a tent. While most countries thought it might be important to make them special purpose items, the Russians looked at how many tents they had, said, hey, that's too many. Let's cut them up, put some holes in them, and like 2 buttons and some string, and call it good. You can see here we even still got the grommets and everything. So, sorry for my lack of dexterity, but let's get into it. This is specifically one of my most favorite rifles because it just refuses to die. Ever since it was first made in 1891 to modern times, it has served in basically every single war that has come about on one side or the other, or sometimes even on both. They were officially replaced by the SKS right after World War II, but with over 37 million of them having been produced, it's kind of hard to run out, even if you want to. Like, you could burn a ton of these and still have tens of millions left over. Granted, it might not be everybody's first choice in firearm. I wouldn't pick it as my first choice, but the fact that it is still being used by Russian and Ukrainian troops in modern day conflict over in Ukraine, that is absolutely fascinating. On top of that, the fact that these were actively being made while cities were burning and handed to troops basically minutes after they were finished being created. They come in at about 9 pounds and roughly 49 inches. For all of you guys using metric, that's about 4 kilos and 1.2, I think it is, M16A4s. So it features a non-detachable internal 5-round magazine, which is incredibly difficult to open. I can barely do it with my freezing hands right now. There we go. But that just makes it even more hard when you have issues with your rimmed cartridges. Speaking of ammo, you can see here we use these 5-round stripper clips, and for some reason the Mosin clips are notoriously bad, and I have to mark them with little smiley faces. This way I know which ones are usable, and as you can tell from the video, they are barely usable at that. It is incredibly difficult at times to get these rounds to seat, and then some other times it just works without an issue. Since the rifle is so incredibly long, especially with the bayonet, and since it is a bolt action requiring much more input from the user, its length leads to it getting caught in basically everything. This was a nightmare to deal with in the bushes, as well as the VTAC. You'll see that I do get caught in it quite often with the front sight post up there, but its length does play to your benefit with the recoil side. This has significantly less recoil than one of the Hugo Mausers. Those are quite a bit shorter than this. I think they come out to about like 21 inches for barrel length. You'll notice as well in a few clips that my top handguard here is always sliding back and forth. That is because this spring right here is notoriously weak and not properly tensioned. This issue can be easily fixed by just putting like some aluminum foil or part of a toothpick inside of there, which I did have originally, but I'm guessing it must have fallen out after some time. So quick, easy fix, not really nothing to worry about in all reality. Before I forget, this is a 1942 stamped gun. You got the little Soviet symbol right there. For some reason, mine is very faint, so unfortunately it's not as pronounced as others are. And I also have a proper Soviet sling. This one here is 1943 stamped, which is always fun to have everything kind of the same in a configuration it might have been used in. Fun fact for you guys, the bayonets on these are actually flathead screwdrivers. And trust me, while not ideal to use as a flathead screwdriver, if you do lose your cleaning kit for whatever reason, the bayonet can be used as a backup way to disassemble your rifle. Ammo for this is fairly expensive. I tend to find myself shooting most of my old Tula ammo, not quite so much of my old corrosive stuff. I'm not particularly fond of cleaning my rifles, and having to actually clean them properly after every time I take them out is definitely not something that I look forward to. Gone are the days of that corrosive ammo being 10 cents a round and these things being like $100, making it so just hosing it off in the front yard isn't a big deal. I try to take a little bit more care of these since prices have inflated as much as they have. Beyond the strippers being just a little bit annoying to use with these, I find that many people struggle to get the bolts to close on rounds. I'm not sure who it is. I think it was 9 Holes. They did a video where they were shooting the Mosin and they had to use a little rubber mallet in order to get the bolt to open and close properly. Mine is not nearly that bad. I've actually been told by many that this is amongst one of the better Mosins that they've shot. I think honestly it's kind of just luck of the draw. That issue specifically comes from the way that the round is controlled. In a Mauser, for example, it uses a controlled feed, right? So what that basically means is when you're pushing that bolt forward, the round seats into the bolt instantly as soon as you're pushing it, whereas the Mosin just kind of pushes the round forward and doesn't get the extractor claw around that rim until the very end when you're getting that final turn in, resulting in a very janky and not so smooth experience. These bolts also have quite a bit of wiggle to them, as you can see here, which really doesn't impact anything. It just doesn't feel as smooth, especially if you just came from shooting a Mauser. You can feel the price difference, I guess you could say. I find it genuinely interesting because there are reports of German soldiers willingly swapping out their Mausers for Mosins during their battles against the Russians. And honestly, having shot both of them, I find that rather perplexing. The only reason I would ever swap out a Mauser for one of these guys is if the Mauser was completely out of ammo. And honestly, the Russians having a good amount of ammo in some of these battles is also kind of fascinating. I'm sure you guys are very aware of the one soldier takes a gun, one soldier takes the ammo trope that has come out. The rifle traces its history back to the 19th century. 1891 was specifically the date of the first adoption by the Russian Empire. This was after an extensive and grueling development cycle by Captain Sergei Ivanovich Mosin and the Belgian engineer Leon Nagant. Since then, there have been tons of iterations of this rifle, such as the Dragoon or Cossack. This one here, the M9130, as I mentioned before. Some of the shorter variants like the M38 and M44, as well as, honestly, one of my favorites, the field-modified version of the M91, if I'm not mistaken, the Obrez pistol. I'd always wanted to try one of those personally. Granted, these are just a small number of the Russian variants that were made. There were quite a few countries, actually, that manufactured these. The Finns produced them, which are obviously known to be one of the highest qualities. I haven't personally shot them, but from what I've heard, they really smoothed out the action and got rid of some of that janky feeling, as I mentioned prior. But most of the countries that made them were countries that Russia owned or had some sort of like sovereignty order to whatever degree that might be. Think of like your comm block countries. Ukraine, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, like all that sector there. A lot of the manufacturing came from there, as well as actually the Chinese as well. The plans were shared with them, as were many plans back in the day. But believe it or not, the US actually manufactured Mosins as well. A order of 3.3 million Mosins was put into place with Remington and Westinghouse. With as many countries producing them as there were, obviously there's a few different caliber conversions that came about, but honestly, most of them are just strictly in 54R. The Americans did some 30-06 conversions, and there's like a few other weird ones out there, but whatever you're going to find is pretty much going to be in 54R. With so much production of this rifle, with so many factories, it's not surprising that there are 34+ million of these guys out there. And it honestly goes to show that the inflated price tags that we see nowadays are a little bit laughable in all reality. What's rather interesting though is with that American contract that I mentioned before, that obviously fell through. Remington and Westinghouse didn't have anybody in the Russian Empire to sell the rifles to. So the Mosin was actually used by the US military at one point, specifically the National Guard, the JROTC, and Reserve Officers Training Corps. I'll also go ahead and pop up a little map right here-ish somewhere showing all the countries and that have used or do currently still use the Mosin. Some of them don't really use it in a very broad sense. Some of them, it was kind of just there for a little bit and then gone. But it still is fascinating to see that something has been this prolific. Back to the history though, and where this came from. During the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 1878, the Russian troops were severely outgunned by their Ottoman counterparts. The Russian troops were mostly armed with their single-shot Berdan rifles, while the Ottomans were using their 1866 lever-action Winchesters. This war eventually led to the 1891 trials, where, as I said before, Mosin and Nagant went against each other. In traditional Russian fashion, Mosin decided to opt out of using quality tools as well as quality material when producing these rifles, so he was heavily criticized by the Russian government for that, resulting in him not directly winning. But Mr. Nagant also unfortunately messed up and made his disassembly process way too complicated for the average soldier. But at the end of the day, the Russians ended up giving the W to Mr. Mosin. I don't find this too surprising. I imagine that it's much simpler to use better manufacturing methods as well as better tools than it is to completely redesign a rifle. I'm not exactly certain how complex it was to disassemble, but I can imagine there was lots of small parts that weren't easily swappable to something much more simple. But this was only after a long and lengthy legal dispute that was initiated by Mr. Nagant over Mr. Mosin's interrupter system for his magazine. For those of you unaware, the interrupter is that, where the hell is it? There it is. That little piece right there is the interrupter. It is specifically there to help assist against rim lock, because obviously these are rimmed cartridges that you can clearly see, as well as stopping double feeding. And I mean, it's fairly easy to actually show it, so I shall show it to you guys on the double feeding end at least. So if you take your rounds and insert them into the rifle, right, and then you push the rounds further in a manner where there would be another round on top of it, the rounds are now seated farther below where the bolt won't pick them up. But if you cycle the bolt, that round now pops up and is able to be fed. This button can also be used to manually eject rounds. This way you don't need to cycle the bolts, but unfortunately I can't get it to work right now. It's a bit cold and I think my fingers are just not really working, but you guys get the idea. But Mr. Nagant was pissed. He claimed that Mosin stole the design from him and his patent, even though like it seems that the patent originally did come from one of Mosin's designs. The reason that Mosin was never able to properly patent it though, was that since he was an officer in the Russian army, that interrupter design was then considered a trade secret, which is honestly kind of just funny how that ended up working, where it ended up working against the Russians at the end of the day. The way the Russians ended up dealing with it though, is they paid out both Nagant and Mosin the winning prize of 200,000 rubles. Mr. Nagant was very clearly not happy though. One of the main reasons why we know these as Mosin Nagants is because of that legal dispute. Whereas many Russians just specifically call these the Mosins, because Nagant obviously went back to Belgium, complained a bunch, and convinced everybody that he was correct. So everyone's like, oh, that's clearly a Mosin Nagant, not just a Mosin. But either way, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope to see you on the next one. Like I said, please like and subscribe. I have been freezing out here today, especially while shooting. My hands right now are icicles. Have a good one, folks.